So we have recording on. We've started the webinar. Thank you all for coming to our next webinar in this series related to hiring ag employees and looking at some of the tools we've developed that we'll be getting out later this year. I'll give Aaron one more minute to connect to audio, and I'll repeat myself in a second. But if you want to go ahead and just type in the chat where you're from and why you're here today. If you have ag employees or you're just a service provider wanting to learn more, feel free to let me know in the chat. You'll also have that while I bring up the PowerPoint. My email turned off so it does not beep at me. So you should be able to see my screen. I'm Paul Geringer. I'm a senior faculty specialist and I'm an extension specialist here at the University of Maryland, and have been working on this project for the past year. Also in the car, but it looked like from the video he was in his car. We have Jesse Ketterman, who is a family consumer science specialist with the University of Maryland Extension, with us here today. He'll be presenting next week and the week after that, so you can get to know him a little bit better when he does that. So, okay. Looks like we have quite a few folks here looking to learn more about the resources we've developed. Yeah, nice to have you all here today. And feel free to ask questions. I'll walk through sort of the PowerPoint and then we'll walk through the guide near the end. So make y'all smaller. Okay, so what I'm here today to talk about is looking at the employee handbook we developed. We based this handbook off of one that was developed by a nonprofit out of Massachusetts, and we kept a lot of the same sections within the book. And we'll talk about the formatting of it, what's in it, how it's set up here, and I'll take you through it at the end, and we'll talk about how you can utilize it or how you could go about utilizing it. I saw we had a couple of extension people in here as well. Utilize it within your own programs. I should point out the guide is specifically geared towards Maryland and Delaware, but with minor modifications, it will work in any state. And we'll kind of talk about those sections that can be modified in any state. So I always like to start these presentations off as on HR, kind of thinking about if you have a farm, how's your current HR situation? Who's handling human resources for you in that operation? And if it's a farm, we automatically know that for the most part, it's always going to be on either the operator or another family member has taken that on. So you always have to keep that in mind within this. We recognize that a lot of this is not what producers want to do, but it's things they have to do within the operation just because they're running a business and they may be having to bring people into it. So we're trying to make this easier for folks to think about. How are people finding new employees? Nate talked about that last week. I will push out the recordings to everybody who's attended after this one, so you have at least 2 to watch with that as well. So, a lot of people, it's hard to find employees. We hear that all the time. It's hard. The reason we put this project together was thinking about ways to look at what employees are asking for and how can we develop that so farms can easily adopt it within their current structure if they want to. And yes, feel free to put questions in the chat and I will look up every now and again and hopefully see if I have a new question to answer. But I'm happy with that. So yeah, how many are providing continuing training to new hires and employees once they're onboarded? That's probably not what's happening in a lot of cases. As I always point out, if it's like when I worked for my parents on their farm, we were just told to go somewhere, do something, and not given a lot of clear direction in how to do it and hope we did it the way they thought we should do it just because that was the way they wanted it done. So in a lot of cases, that's maybe the way we're doing it, but there may be areas where we actually do need to train folks up and start thinking about that in those cases. And as I like to end with this on, I believe this last question I have, how many people have a human resources department on the farm? Most don't. As I said before, we know it's the owner or operator usually handling that or a family member or someone else. So we're trying to provide resources that will help out with that. So I just like to point out, we do have a growing number of ag workers, as many of you probably know, who don't have experience working in the operation. They may have no experience in ag. That lack of experience may not be bad, but it also may require you to train employees, onboard them, help them learn what they need to know, at least beyond the basics of what they're supposed to be doing. So with this guide, the first thing we really need to talk about is at-will employment versus contractual employment. And the reason we need to talk about that is basically if we look at it within the guide, and I'll show you parts of the guide here in a minute, that this could be considered a contract. We need to make very clear if we're going to start using employee handbooks that that's not a contract. It's not a contractual term as to how we can get rid of them. So with at-will employment, and many of us probably already know this, but its employment is at will of the employer and the employee. Typical is it's for an indefinite period of time. It may be for a specific period of time we hire them, but in a lot of cases, it's indefinite and it's just at the will of both parties. If one of us wants to walk away, we can. For the employer, we can get rid of employees really easily in this case, as long as we don't break certain laws when we do it. But, and from the employee standpoint, if they don't like the job, they can leave with the proper notice that may be required. So that's where we want people to be typically. Contract employment is basically, we have to have a reason to fire them in the case that they violated a term in the contract or something about that. My best analogy for this is I have, if the contract is for a period of 2 years for a growing season, then they give up that ability to terminate unless there's a reason within the contract we're going to terminate the employment. These are things we need to think about within doing this. The other good example is, and we see this all the time in college athletics, we fire a coach or something, we may have to pay them to go away because it's contractual employment. Unless they do something to violate the terms of their contract, it's really hard to get rid of people in certain cases. So with this guide, we really want to make sure that the guide doesn't create a contractual relationship if we don't want that to exist. If you have a contractual relationship already with them and it's contract employment, that should be the guiding principle there. If it's at-will employment, we want to keep it at-will employment. So as I'm going to point out, with a contract and with a handbooks, both can limit termination when job performance is unsatisfactory or it's a breach in the terms of the contract or the employee handbook. We want to do that, but we want to make it clear within the guide that this really still is an at-will relationship where we have some of that freedom to get out of it. The contract, and in some cases, the guide, if we don't work on it clearly, can be a two-edged sword. It gives the employee more security, but it really does limit what the employer can do in a lot of cases. I also pointed out, and Nate talked about this last week, it's going to require employee evaluations and stuff like that, or at least for you to think about how to do that. And it's also going to require you to follow the handbook, because if it didn't exist, you don't have to follow it if it doesn't exist. If it exists, you really do need to stick to it and make sure you're following the rules within what you set forward. We really want you to think about this because no one wants to get hit with a wrongful termination suit. They're rare to happen, but this will help you document why you terminated employees. Even if it's at will, it will help you do that down the road. So let's talk a little bit about the employee handbook. So this employee handbook is legally to protect, to create. It's really for the employer to create a legal situation to better protect them. It's Friday. My brain cannot talk today. It's an excellent way to communicate to employees what the expectations are. The other thing it can do is, as many of you know who have hired people, there are a lot of notifications you have to post in common areas where folks can see them. We have to have, stuff related to how to report discrimination, what fair labor standards are within wage, overtime, sick leave, stuff like that, depending on what your state law requires. We may have to have those posters up. We've all seen in various spots where it's common for employees to be able to see this. This puts a lot of those notifications in one spot where it's really easy to communicate to the employee what's going on. A good employee manual avoids pitfalls and considers the best practices and legal considerations that are outlined in the document. And it's a great way to start this process in whatever you want to do within your farming, within your farm, or to help growers better understand what they need to be doing. The other thing it's going to do, and we're going to go through a lot of this as we go through it, it lays out the expectations on the farm. It's very clear to understand, okay, if I'm going to be, out today for sick leave, who do I have to contact? If I want to take time off, who do I need to contact to be able to do that? How many days notice do I need to give to be able to do that? It also allows you to better provide even and fair treatment to your employees. That way, everyone's on the same page. We know what the rules are. We can do this. This has been something we've been trying to work on to develop for a few years, mainly because it helps farms better stay being fair, equal, and show they're following rules to make sure their employees are being trained well and understand the practices. We really wanted to do this a lot, or I wanted to do it a lot for livestock operations, because it really can be a way to lay out animal handling practices, good husbandry practices that we would expect in that operation. So if something does happen and things go wrong, we can document, we actually were training employees well. Here's what we said we were going to be doing. Here's how we did it. And it's a good way to orient new employees on what's going on the farm and what they need to be doing. When we get this done, it's going through a review process right now, and I'll talk about some of the areas where it's still being reviewed because we have to get a few things approved. For the university folks on there, when you see one part, you'll understand what I'm talking about. That this template will provide the content and explain why to include it. I'm going to walk through what we have, how you understand what that is, by showing you the guide and not just screenshots on a PowerPoint, and allowing you an opportunity to ask me questions in just a couple of slides. Some sections include sample language. We provide you with the language that you can use, but you can modify it to fit your farm. In a lot of cases where state law in Maryland or Delaware said you didn't have to do it, we may have said you could do it in that case, because it was easier to get you to think about the positive and move to the negative if you didn't want to stay in the positive. One example of that is for those in Maryland and Delaware. Maryland provides for unpaid sick leave to farm workers. Well, we included that it would include paid sick leave, but you can easily modify that to be unpaid sick leave. In the end, it was easier to move it from a positive to negative, and it also gets the farm owner to think about, is that something I want to do, based off what Jesse and Maria are going to talk about, or I guess just Jesse next week. And when sample language is not included, you can think about how to include it, mainly because it really does need to be tailored to your operation. And there are some areas where we didn't provide sample language. We just told you what the law was. You can think about how you want to include that or not. And we'll lay out some of those here in a minute. When it's all said and done, we're going to keep the Massachusetts model with this. It will be a downloadable Word document that you can easily copy and paste from, delete what you don't want from into a new, create your own document with all of this in. The idea is to make it easy upon you to create an employee handbook. So let's talk about the employee handbook, and I'm going to switch to it here in a minute, and we can go over it. As you go through this, there are going to be certain sections you're going to see 2 stars at. Those are sections you need to include. You really need to include them. They are either legal things you need to have in there just to stay in compliance with the law, or they're things where you're potentially going to have problems down the road. Anything else that you just see 1 star on, that's something you can include. You don't have to include it. It's up to you. It's up to what you think works best for that farming operation. So a couple of sections, and I'm going to move to it here after this slide. The basics are, talking about what the farm is. What's the background of the farm? I'll give you a second to look at the one I had that we developed based off what Massachusetts had here in a minute. Talk about the manual, why it exists. Talk about that this is still at-will employment, and provide your equal opportunity statement that in many cases has to be provided, relying on federal law within this. And then there are other sections within that we can talk about. And I'm going to stop sharing this screen. And if folks have questions, feel free to type them in the chat. I will guide brought up and go back up to the top. And you should be seeing a copy of the guide now. So it's a PDF mainly because I just wanted an easier to scan through document that didn't, if there were like grammar issues or anything, you didn't get those lines showing up. So you started judging my grammar. I'd rather you judge my speaking ability than my grammar ability. Good employee manuals, as we already talked about, they need to reflect what's actually going on the farm. That's why we want you to modify this. It's going to lay out that code of conduct, provide the legal map, communicate the history of the farm, the culture, what's expected, as we've already talked a lot about this. Here are a lot of the sections we're going to have in it, so you can start looking at it. I'll show you the intro to the farm, the about the manual. If we have employment categories, we really need to lay that out. Jesse's going to talk about this next week when it comes to when you're starting to think about health insurance and retirement. If we're offering health insurance retirement to employees, we have to do that fairly across categories. So if we have one category of employee on the farm, we have to offer many of the same benefits to those employees. If we start categorizing them, we can start doing things separately to them. In a lot of cases, depending on the state, ag workers are going to be exempt from overtime law. Maryland and Delaware have some weird rules related to that we need to keep in mind when we're doing it. Work schedules, what's the attendance policy going to be? What does state law say on how often you have to pay employees? If you've never paid attention to that and you're a farm employer, you probably should, because most state laws lay out how often employees have to be paid, when that payment needs to be made, and when it's expected to be made once timesheets are turned in. What happens if we have personnel records? How's that going to be kept? As I said, there's going to be sections with 2 stars. You really need to include in the sick leave and the family medical leave. Talk about bereavement leave. I'm going to keep scrolling down. The other thing we need to think about within all this, and I'll show you some examples, is thinking about if we're going to have, what are the pregnancy related rights and the accommodations that need to be made within that. There are some changing federal laws in place that make it easier for pregnant women to be able to get accommodations in the workforce than what it had been before. So things we need to pay attention to. What happens if we are hiring people that may have a disability, or they may need religious accommodations? I know here we deal a lot with poultry workers who are growingly more Muslim or of other faiths. So there may have to be more religious accommodations made for them than what we would expect normally in some cases, and taking into account things we may not culturally understand, but we need to be aware of in these cases. What's the workforce culture going to be? What's the code of conduct going to be? What's going to be expected? I'll walk you through these in a second. What's the safety information that needs to be provided? If we're spraying pesticides, what's the safety information they need to be aware of in doing that? If we're dealing with fruits and vegetables, other things, food safety issues, cleanliness, product quality. Are we going to allow social media to be used on the farm beyond what the farm may be doing? Do we want the employees taking pictures while they're on the farm? We probably don't in some cases, because they can be taken out of context. We may not want that to happen. What about visitors on the farm? Are we going to allow them to bring their friends, their family onto the farm while they're there? Or is there going to be a process where they have to go to be able to meet with you in one certain area? what's the phone policy on the farm? The other thing we're going to talk about, and these are some of the areas where it's taking a little bit longer to get through because we have to run these through University General Counsel to look at, what's the drug and alcohol policy going to be? What's the tobacco, cannabis, and vaping policy going to be? Maryland's currently a state that allows, recreational cannabis. So we got to think about how's that going to play into the farm. We probably don't want certain things used on the farm, alcohol, cannabis, other drugs. So we really need to think about what that's going to look like on the farm and what can happen. We also may not want certain things done just because it may jeopardize. We have to have CDL licenses or other licenses through the state where there may be testing involved. We really do need to think about that. The longest section of this whole guide will be the sexual harassment and discrimination discrimination prevention policy, because it is pretty much a copy and paste from what state law requires in Maryland and Delaware to be in there to report any incidents and to make sure people understand their rights when something like that happens. And then I'll walk you through. So kind of walk you through the sections. A lot of those are the sections you need to start thinking about having. And the final guide is going to look a little bit different than this. This is an older version, and we've added a couple of sections since it was finalized, since I downloaded this version for the workshops. So, we took a simple story about the farm, told what they do, we made it up. Actually, Massachusetts made it up and I modified it for Maryland. But we really need to think about, do we want to tell people what this farm is about, the history of the farm, so they get a sense of what the farm is about and they can better understand what the farm does. It's a great way to tell your story within this. Like I said before, we really do have sample language to kind of show that this guide doesn't change anything related to the employment. If the employment's at will, you're still at will. We don't want that to change. We give you some equal opportunity language in here, so you understand how that's to be written. We recognize this is not something that producers normally want to write or have to write. So we give you some sample language you can cut and paste in to do it. With this, we may need to take into account other laws we're not talking about in this. We may need to take into account Migrant and Seasonal Worker Protection Act, especially if we're dealing with H-2As that are coming in every summer to work within the farm. What are our employment categories going to be? We give some examples of that. Do we have part-time? Do we have full-time? Do we have exempt, non-exempt? We can come up with those terminologies for what they mean. If people have questions on that, want help thinking about what that would look like, they can reach out to me or typically, and I can help them think about those processes. What are the overtime rules? Like I said, in most states, everybody's exempt in ag from overtime. But in a couple of cases, you may not be exempt. Maryland's law is really weird because it appears everybody's exempt, even though there's an exemption that says everyone over 60 hours can get it. Delaware has no state specific, but everybody that, because of that, falls under the Fair Labor Standards Act, the federal law, and that exempts ag workers for the most part from overtime. So we need to think about that in a lot of cases. What's that work schedule going to be like? When are rest breaks going to take place? How do we lay that out so folks understand it? If you have questions, please let me know at any point. I'm happy to answer them. The whole point of this is kind of to walk you through what you should be thinking about in an employment guide. Go to the more important things to think about. What's the payroll schedule going to look like? Most employees are required to be paid within 6 days of the end of a pay period. That can change a little bit depending on state law. What are the things we can legally deduct? Usually federal, state taxes, any deductions for Social Security, Medicare, payroll, state payroll taxes, but we may have to deduct other things that we may not be thinking about. We may have to think about, are there things we have to deduct, like health insurance benefits that Jesse is going to talk about, retirement in some cases? Are we going to make deductions for, calls that are being made on a work phone, any personal loans, anything there? But we also may have to take into account what are the court order deductions that may come into place. We may be looking at somebody that has to pay child support or something like that. So we got to keep that in mind and make sure we're keeping all of that clear. I'm going to continue to walk through this because for those in Maryland, we're going to get to some of the more confusing parts real quick. Within Maryland, we are required to provide sick and safe leave for any worker. It can be paid or unpaid depending on where they fall within the law. Ag employees all fall under unpaid sick leave, but you have to give it, and there has to be a way to be able to get that sick leave. As I said before, we lay out within this that you will be paid for sick leave, but you can easily go back and do that. We laid it out to be, you get paid 1 hour paid sick time for every 30 hours worked. And you can carry up to a maximum of 40 hours a year. Now what happens if you're using it? When do you have to go back? What all happens within Maryland and Delaware? That law allows you off for family and medical leave as well. So you can think about how that plays in as well and how that's going to happen as well. For the most part, states do not require bereavement leave for small employers. So most farms are going to fall under the laws that do not require bereavement leave when we have a family member, a friend, or someone pass away. If the farm's over 15 employees, we may need to think about what's going to happen in those cases, but we may still want to have sample language that comes in to lay off. What we're going to do if somebody has a family member or close friend pass away. Here, we said you would give 3 days off for that, but you want to take that into consideration for what you want. Other things to keep in mind is you're required to let people off for jury duty, so make them aware that they're required off for jury duty. And like I said, if you got questions about the guide, please put them in the chat. The workshops we kind of have a more free-flowing dialogue. It's harder to do, or if you want to raise your hand, I can see the participants and I can let you start talking if you want to. Voting laws, you're required in Maryland to at least get 2 hours of leave to vote on the day, paid leave. Military, you have to let people off when they have military service to provide. Domestic violence leave under Maryland and Delaware. Maryland, you're required to let that fall under the sick and safe leave if they need to leave because they have a fear of domestic violence. That's that unpaid sick leave, or in Delaware, you have to provide a reasonable accommodations to them to help them. For the most part, there's no requirements you have sick leave or vacation leave in any of this, but you need to think about, do I want to do that within this? How am I going to do that? We don't provide a sample policy for that just because that's something you really need to think about and how that's going to work for your farm. That is an added expense within the farm that people may not be able to afford to add on vacation leave for folks. But it may be something that workers start wanting that we have to think about how to do it. I'm going to keep going down for the most part. I skipped the most important part. So we got to ask this question earlier this week on this. For the most part, farms are exempt from unemployment. Maryland only requires it when you have 3 full-time employees and at least an annual payroll of $15,000. Delaware ag employers are exempt from workers' compensation insurance requirements. Although you're exempt in a lot of cases, it's still a good idea to think about including workers' compensation insurance potentially within the operation, just because in states like Maryland, which I'm more familiar with than I am with Delaware, I work in Maryland and I've dealt more with Maryland workers' comp legal claims. Within Maryland, if you are an exempt employer and you have an employee get hurt on the farm, they go through what is known as the state's unfunded workers' compensation fund. And within that, if the worker does get workers' compensation out of that fund, typically the state will come back on the ag employer who was exempt to pay it. So it's always a good case in a lot of cases to have workers' comp insurance at a minimal level, just so you can better protect yourself down the road if there's a claim. agriculture is a job that involves a lot of risk where people can get hurt. We really need to think about how to minimize some of that risk in all of this. We lay out sample languages for what happens if you do have a workers' comp claim, to think about how to do that. Workers' unemployment insurance also exempt for the most part. But laws, keep in mind, we lay out when you may have to include that in. We also lay out where you need to submit your claim to within the guide, so the employee is automatically aware of if there is a following where they need to make an unemployment claim, where do they go? Something normally you find in unemployment guides or in handbooks. Jesse and then we'll talk more about health insurance next week or the week after. I can't remember the flow of this, but it's going to be within the next couple of weeks. Last two. The other thing to think about, and I pointed this out, is we really will have to think about within this pregnancy-related rights and accommodations. Both states, Maryland and Delaware, I'm unfamiliar with a couple of states that were listed in there. So things to think about, I think it was Idaho and Wisconsin, but here we do have, and I believe most states, there are protections to protect pregnant employees. You're required to provide reasonable accommodations. The way that normally works is the pregnant employee needs to show, typically how other similarly disabled employees, which is an odd way to put it, have been accommodated in the past. That can be really hard when this is the first person this has ever happened to in that operation. The other thing to point out is a new federal law went into effect last year. This law covers employers with at least 15 employees and makes it easier to show what a reasonable accommodation would be. We're still waiting on the regs to come out with that law. I've had a student kind of laying out based off what we've seen could potentially be in them, what would be in that. So we're trying to get a separate piece put together to provide with this so folks know what that is. We lay out some language to kind of help with that. As I said before, generally you gotta provide reasonable accommodations due to disabilities, if they're temporary, long-term. And we do need to have specific religious observance in there. And in a lot of this, it's just tell somebody so they can discuss what that reasonable accommodation would be. If it's during, say, for instance, Ramadan, we may need to look at like, how do we reasonably make sure that employee, has an accommodation for that month in that case, if something needs to be done. Laying out what the workplace culture is. It's just a good section to have so folks know what culture to expect when they lay in. If there's a conflict, how are we going to resolve that, in a safe way? Pesticide safety. I'm almost through the guide and we can take questions on a lot of this. Food safety, cleanliness, public conduct. We lay out, what's a social media policy? You may not want people bringing cell phones or phones and posting on X, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. I think I've hit all the major social medias. Be Real, LinkedIn. What do you want to limit people to do? Because it really could be a picture taken out of context on their social media that creates problems for you. Typically, we're going to want visitors to come into a certain area and not just have free range, because there can be problems. People can get hurt if they don't know where they're going. So we really need to provide what that's going to be. If we don't want people to have their cell phones on the work site, that's great. We can do that. We just really need to make sure that there is somebody there that can make a phone call if somebody gets hurt. We need to have that ability to get people to 911 if they need it, or get emergency services out there if something happens. We really do need to think about that. But in some cases, we may want people to have phones because if they're picking produce, picking something, it may be easier for them to be able to listen to music, a podcast, something they want to hear to keep them going throughout the day. So we really need to think about that. We're going to allow our equipment to be used by them on their own personal farms. What's that mean? Personal belongings. And as I said, the thing that's taking the longest time to get out of here is the drug policy. Mainly because for those not at land grants, we can't do certain things that violate federal law. And we need to make sure that even though it's legal in the state of Maryland, it's still illegal under federal law, so we need to make sure anything within this section does not violate federal law and what we're saying or putting out there. Basically, within the sample language, we eliminate all ability to do drugs or alcohol while on the job and making sure that's not there. We have a tobacco policy that pretty much does not allow you to do tobacco on site just because it may be harder to show what you're actually doing in that case. Zero tolerance for violence policy within the farm, just to make sure that is. I always have to point out to people, because I've had this question asked to me many times, the employer can limit your right to bring a firearm on the property. That's not a violation of the Second Amendment because your employer is not the government. The Second Amendment only protects you against the government, not you against your employer. They have the right to set the types of things we want in there. And we may not want people to be able to bring weapons into the farm just because it can create other problems, but we may actually need them, specifically we're in certain areas of the country where we may need to deal with wild hogs, other pests, snakes, bears, name the animal to come out. All things that can happen in Maryland except for the wild hogs. What's the dress code going to look like? You know, we want to make sure people are wearing things that are accommodating for the job and not going to get us in trouble for violating food safety requirements, stuff like that. Lay out what the farm pace is going to be like so people know what's going to go in there. If we're dealing with livestock, lay out what the animal handling practices are going to be. We really want that laid out. And finally, this is the whole thing that takes a while because we had to lay out all the definitions for what harassment could look like and where you report. I always point this out when we put it in there. There'll be one thing in bright yellow. Typically, that's where you need to go in and insert what you want there. That's the stuff you're going to have to put in that can't be set by state law and already has a state reporting requirement. This needs to be put in where you need to do it. We've already put in the locations, if I remember correctly, within this for where for violations they should be reported to the state. This is for you to be able to put in so people can report it to you as well. Yep, we have the state reporting requirements. We have both for Maryland and Delaware. And then those are pretty much it. After that, it's pretty much just a layout, what the farm is like, setting out some acknowledgements. Getting an attorney to review this is very important at the end, so we want to take that into consideration as well. And I'll go back to my PowerPoint real quick. Finish this up. I'm going to open it up to you for questions. And I can give you a copy of the PowerPoint later I'll send it out when I push out the videos as well. So why do you want to have this handbook? As I said before, it's going to lay out all the guidelines you're going to hold employees to. At the same time, it's going to hold you to those rules too. The rules allow, it allows you to provide the information you need to provide to employees. It's a really good way to help everybody stay on the same page as to what the farm is about. And then finally, it's going to make us, as Nate talked about last week, as we start doing all this, we're potentially going to have to think about how to evaluate employees' performance. Why? Well, if we're going to have to get rid of them down the road or they're not working out, we may want to work to evaluate them and provide them with ways to get better. This is going to allow you to document that better. You're going to have the practices in there, like we put in animal husbandry practice. We're dealing with a vegetable operation. We're going to want to put in a lot of the food safety requirements and the GAP certifications that may be required, other things that may need to be done in order to keep the farm in compliance with the laws. So, and the other thing, and Nate talked about this last week too, but I always put this in here. Whatever we're doing with employees, especially when evaluating them, conduct them in a positive environment, at least try to be positive. So I always point out, people don't want to listen to people yelling at them. It's like, parents aren't on this. I can say this. As a kid, I never wanted to, I didn't listen well when my parents yelled at me. I listened better when they sat down and explained things to me in a much more positive way. I didn't really learn anything when I was yelled at. It was always in better situations where I wasn't being like, oh, wow, I really shouldn't do it that way because I'm just going to get yelled at. I didn't learn anything from it. I just learned not to get yelled at or to hide it better. So it also presents expectations, present these expectations frequently, plainly, and always in writing when people are doing it. When misconduct happens, if we're not using the right animal handling techniques, take the time to explain verbally and then in writing how they messed up. We always have to do it in writing, so then there's documentation as to what went on. If this was not being recorded, I would talk about all the times I've had to document things employees are doing that work for me, just so I have it after I verbally explain to them what went wrong, just so we have a record. So down the road, I can go, I actually did try to show this employee how to handle the situation better. When you're disciplining employees or talking to them about violations, make sure they're actual violations of either the handbook or whatever the terms of their employment is. Don't do it unfairly. If you discipline one person for one thing, you got to do it fairly. It creates problems. And I always point out, you can't just discipline people because they annoy you. And then if the issue continues and we have done all this, we can get rid of them. But termination should never be the first step. None of this is easy. And after hiring, it's going to take a lot of work. What we're hoping is the guide will help you develop that. And if you have thoughts about the guide, let me know in the chat. You can also turn your mics on. I'm going to put the QR, I'm going to put the link in the thing here in the chat here in a second, but please take a minute to tell us what you thought about this. This is all grant funded by the Northeast Risk Management Education Center. And we need some stuff to report back to the funder as to was this useful, was it not useful? Any questions? And there's my contact info. I can put that in there as well in a minute. But I will stop there and stop sharing my screen. What questions do folks have? And if you want to, just raise your hand and you can ask questions. And you can turn your mic on.
Hi, Paul. This is Brooke Shago. I'm not sure if it was in the employee handbook or not, but when I was originally and I'm in Maryland, and when I was originally reaching out to the state regarding workers' comp, on their website, there's a little asterisk, a little tiny italics that says there are exemptions for ag workers. And I reached out to the email and they sent me this PDF, and it was regarding wages and how there was I believe it was 3 categories that certain ag employees are minimum wage exempt. Is that in this handbook?
That is not, but we need to get that added in.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I was surprised when they sent me that information. Because I didn't know there was any minimum wage exemptions. But like I said, I can forward you the little PDF that they sent me, that the workers' comp department, the Department of Labor sent me. So I thought that was interesting, and I was curious if it was included in this handbook or not.
I'm going back, and then right as I need to go back up to the top, my thing, but Adobe is freezing up on me. And now as I think about, actually, we probably did. I think we did include it. There's so much in this guide. I have to go back and relook to make sure if we actually did include it. I believe we did include it because I think I know the 3 categories you're talking about.
Okay, like I said, I was just curious because I know it was new news to me. So.
Oh wait, no, we didn't, because we figured that's in a separate document. It's not in this. We didn't
Okay.
anything on wages in this, but yes. Yeah, because one is if they're picking by the piece, if I remember correctly. They're so far from the place and they're picking by the piece, and if they're hurting animals overnight. Yes. Thank you for that reminder. We do need to make sure that's highlighted somewhere in here.
Yep, no worries. Thanks.
Any other questions, thoughts? And I'm getting the link for all of you right now to take the thing. I pointed out it was really easy to manage the group, so only Jesse needed to show up while he's in a car. And there, if you can take that survey. Any other questions? I can give you 15 minutes back. We're hoping to roll all this out later sometime this spring. And all of you, by registering, we will reach out to you at the end, and Jesse can correct me if I'm wrong, once everything's done, and we will send you a thumb drive with all the materials on it. So the stuff that Nate talked about last week, and then this guide will come to you as a Word doc there as well. And then we'll send out the health insurance and retirement planning stuff that's gonna come in. And I will say the health insurance and retirement's not just for farm employees, but it's also for the employer to think about for themselves and how to do that. But if there are no other questions, I can stop the recording and let you guys go for the day. Okay. Thank you all for attending, and tune in next Friday at noon and you will hear from Jesse. And I do not remember if it's health insurance or retirement, but it will be one of the two. I believe it's gonna be
Health insurance.
health insurance, and retirement's the last piece. So yes, you hear Jesse for the next 2 weeks. So yes. Tune in next Friday at the same time. Thank you for attending.